Thanks, Matteo. So Stavroula, if I can, I don't know if I say your name very well, but yeah, if you can present yourself, like 1 minute, and you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Unmute. Yes, thank you. I'm Stavroula Tsinorema. Yes, you pronounce my name perfectly well. It's all Greek, but you did very well. I am professor of philosophy and bioethics in the philosophy department of the University of Crete, Greece. And I have an interest in the ethics of science, bioethics, and technoethics particularly. So I'm very pleased to be with you, and thank you very much for taking me on board as an ethics advisor.
Yeah, thanks to you for agreeing. And Louise?
Hi everyone, I'm Louise Bezuidenhout. I'm a senior researcher at the CWTS Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands. I'm a specialist in open science. I'm particularly looking at issues of justice, equity, and inclusion through the expansion of the open science movement. And I do a lot of work with research infrastructures over the last few years, so I guess that's kind of why I'm here.
And Heikki?
Hello, my name is Heikki Lihavainen. I'm the director of Svalbard Integrated Arctic Earth Observing System. In comparison with Louise and Stavroula, I'm probably a layman representatives in ethical board, as I don't have such a deep knowledge about this than Louise and Stavroula, but I do have some insight what comes to different aspects of research infrastructure, especially in ethical issues in Arctic surroundings. And my previous life, I was with Finnish Meteorological Institute scientist doing research on climate and air quality interactions in different levels. Thank you.
I love the mixture. I think the three of you make a very powerful club, to tell us what we're doing well or wrong or how to make things better. So thanks so much. I will see my screen now, and then we can go and I'll show you the agenda. Let me show this guy full screen. Let me make begin. And let me just put you all in this other corner. Okay, so I think we've done the welcome and the introductions. We have our three wonderful experts here with us, and we're gonna ask, they're gonna give us like a very short overview on general tips on ethics management from the three different angles and the three different perspectives that they have presented here in the intros. Then we would like to be able to know, we all know that our methodology within the project, and in a way we have followed the guidelines that the Commission give us, is to go, we have sent these assessments, ethics assessments, which to the whole consortium, well, to different people in the consortium, depending on how the content material apply to it. I don't know if we can have a discussion around that in terms of what you think, if you can give us feedback into whether these tables, we can have an exchange between the consortium and yourselves to go through these tables. We're in the process of collecting the tables right now, so I don't think you may have had time to see the results of that. I don't expect you to do that because we are just about collecting those. So that's okay. But maybe our consortium has questions, and maybe you can give us feedback saying this part of the table is actually useful, or this is useless, or this does not apply, or based on an exchange of that. And then we have more questions and discussions, and then Matteo, who is here, is the leader in the project representing all the ethical aspects. He will tell us our little marathon that we have until the end of July to achieve our deliverable and our work together. We asked our project officer if we could be slightly delayed on these matters. They did not recommend it because the way the project is funded, they only pay you if you complete the work. So any uncompleted work or late, it may have repercussions on things like payment. So we really want to work towards the deadline of our deliverables, which is the 31st of July. So if we can fulfill this deadline, it would be wonderful for all of us. So is that a good plan? Anyone wants to add anything to the agenda, or you agree? You're happy? Yeah. You all three have your presentations, right? So, yeah. Okay. So then, yeah, I would say just listen to the people, and then at the end of each presentation, you can have questions, but there will be plenty of opportunities for having a chat, right? So then I will start with Louise, and then just if you can share the screen, we'll stop the sharing, and then you can take over on the presentation. And thank you so much for doing these preparations.
No worries at all. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I think I got perhaps the easier mandate from Stavroula and Heikki, because I was just asked to talk about the general ethical considerations relating to the ENVRI-Hub NEXT project. And I think this is already well established in the document that's in circulation, but just to give a brief snapshot of what we need to start thinking about. Obviously, the project is really interesting in its design because it's using a number of different data integrations and data processing practices. So the three core elements that were identified in the document were AI, data, and humans. And thinking about how those work together obviously raise some ethical issues. The core ethical issues, ethical areas that I think will come to the front in this project are issues relating to open science, issues relating to the integration of data, and issues relating to the AI and advanced processing. And obviously, these are all areas that are works in progress at the moment. There are topics of continual discussion within ethics. So it's not like there is a right way or a wrong way to do it, but rather that this is an evolving discussion within ethics, and it's an evolving discussion within all projects. So finding spaces to have constructive and regular conversations, I think, will be very helpful for the project. And I just wanted to go through the three areas in a bit more detail to highlight some of the core documents that perhaps will be very useful for consortium members. And in relation to open science, really the core text that I think needs to be in circulation amongst the consortium is the UNESCO recommendation on open science. I'm sure perhaps for many people on the call, this is at least partially familiar. But to those of you who aren't that familiar with it, it's quite a new document that came out in 2021, and it was signed by all partner states of UNESCO, which means that all the countries represented in the ENVRI-Hub NEXT project are actually signatories to this recommendation. And in contrast to earlier formulations of open science, the UNESCO recommendation sets out a really ambitious program and ambition for open science in the future. So what the recommendation does is not only talk about the need to open up scientific knowledge and to open up knowledge infrastructures, but also talks about the obligations towards the open engagement of societal actors and open dialogue with other knowledge systems, which have been topics of conversation with open science, perhaps, but not as prominently central to open science as they are in the recommendation. And what the UNESCO recommendation really does is highlight the fact that open science is not only about making sure that open science knowledge is accessible, but also that the production of the knowledge is inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. So it sets out a very ambitious recommendation to include dialogue with society, to include dialogue with other knowledge systems, and to ensure that the knowledge that is held outside of academia is also being integrated into knowledge generation in the future. What's also very interesting about the UNESCO recommendation is that it takes ethics as the starting point for these discussions around open science. So the UNESCO recommendation identifies 4 core values that it sees as driving forward any openness, open activities within research in the future. And these are quality and integrity, which are perhaps the most familiar of the values in relation to open science, but then goes on to have three other sets of values that are more outward focused and societally focused. So looking at collective benefit, equity and fairness, and diversity and inclusiveness as core for driving forward this open science program in the future. And on the right of the screen, you can see some of the societal actors and stakeholders that UNESCO sees as needing to be integrated into knowledge generation in the future. So you can see it's very ambitious because it sets out a wide range of individuals that are identified as knowledge holders that potentially would need to be integrated into research and knowledge production in the future. So it is quite a challenging step away from the more familiar, comfortable open access, open data, fair data, free and open source software, and challenges us to think about how we can open up all aspects of knowledge generation in the future to create this new vision of open science that is outlined in the recommendation. And by the way, please do feel free to put up your hand or stop me at any point, because I know I do get very excited about open science, so I do talk quite fast. The second area that was identified as core for the ethics of this project is the integration of data. And for that, we really see the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity as driving forward how we should be thinking about this area. So the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, I think, will be quite familiar to a lot of people, either as the document itself or as a permutation of the document that has been integrated into research integrity training at university levels or at project levels. And the research integrity discussions are really focused on transparency and honesty. So taking into account all practices and processes within data generation and within the research lifecycle that encourage transparency, honesty, and then taking into account societal impact and the responsibility that research has to society. So this perhaps is more looking towards the individual researcher, their responsibilities within their research, but then also thinking a lot about data management, responsible data management planning, and so forth. So, and then obviously the integration of data and AI, those two fields do overlap quite a lot. And one of the core areas that is going to come up in a lot of discussions for this project is obviously GDPR. So GDPR is something that I think a lot of people are quite scared of because it does seem very, very formal and legal. But obviously, a lot of institutions do have GDPR officers that can help researchers if they have questions around these areas of these specific areas. But GDPR generally offers a set of guidelines, rules for how organizations handle personal data and strengthen individuals' control over data. So this is very, very important within the EU to ensure that individuals who are contributing towards knowledge generation, individuals who are contributing towards data that drives forward research agendas, have and retain control over their data and how it is used. It's also important to notice that while GDPR legislation focuses on the European Union, it does apply also to organizations outside of the EU who deal with EU citizen data. And I think that's very important for these distributed projects and these consortia projects to recognize that while the legislation is identified and linked to a specific geographic area, this can have implications beyond the borders of the EU. And GDPR is also increasingly aligned with personal data protection acts from countries outside of the EU. So, for example, the South African POPIA Act is modeled on the GDPR. So there are very interesting interlinks. And I think this is something that will continually need to be revisited and discussed within the consortia, how to align these expectations around individual control over data and how to ensure that that there is harmonization in the way that data are being handled and processed. What did I do? The other area that I think is overlapping between integration of data and AI is the topic of dual use. So dual use, there's EU recommendations and legislations around dual use. And this is a topic that was very, very, very highly discussed around the turn of the century, but then kind of fell a little bit towards the background and now is coming to the front again quite heavily. Dual use can refer to two different issues, and I've put those definitions into the slide. The first definition of dual use are items, goods, software, and technologies that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. And in relation to current discussions on dual use, this tends to be the definition that is used most commonly. The second definition of dual use, which is the one that is an earlier definition, refers to beneficial research that can be misused by third parties for nefarious purposes. So thinking about research that is well-intended and has beneficial outcomes for society, but could be repurposed by malicious actors for negative purposes. And while these are slightly different definitions, it's very important to recognize the responsibility that both definitions place on researchers, on projects and organizations to keep monitoring how data are being used and to keep anticipating whether there are potential situations in which beneficial research generated during research projects could be misused. So it's kind of thinking about the longer term oversight of data once the project is finished, the longer oversight of how data are reused and recombined. And this brings us on to AI and advanced processing. And obviously, the core text that will be of particular importance for the project is Ethics by Design and Ethics of Use Approaches for AI, which is a European Commission document. And this sets out a number of ethical expectations for researchers and projects and organizations engaging in AI and advanced processing. And advanced processing, obviously, is quite a broad spectrum of different activities. And these refer to respect for human agency, privacy and data governance, fairness, individual and social and environmental well-being, transparency and accountability and oversight. And it's a very helpful document because it does provide more concrete ways in which these ethical expectations can be integrated into research projects. This is also backed up by the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI, which is another very helpful text. The UNESCO recommendation puts the protection of human rights and dignity at the cornerstone of the way it's envisioning ethics of AI and outlines four key priorities that responsible AI in the future needs to be considering. And these are that any AI should respect human rights and human dignity, that it should promote living in a peaceful, just, and interconnected society, that it should enable diversity and inclusiveness, and support environmental and ecosystem flourishing. And I think the last two are particularly topics that are not particularly well elucidated in ethics of AI at the moment, and would be very interesting for this consortia to take perhaps a lead in thinking critically about this. How do you ensure diversity of data, diversity of perspectives, and inclusiveness when you are generating data and designing AI algorithms? And how can you ensure that advanced processing potentially for environmental models and for sustainable development goals research does not impact on the environment and the ecosystem through the energy generation that needed to run the models and to store the data. So I think there's some very interesting conversations that need to have be had within this consortia. So there's can sometimes seem to be three quite different areas, and obviously they are quite distinct areas of ethical discussion, but they all kind of coalesce around the same values. And I do think the UNESCO Open Science values kind of cover most of the ethical values that are described within the data processing, the AI, and the open science. But also, if we just add kind of meta values of justice, dignity, and flourishing to these values, we get a really good idea of how these different values play out in these different areas and how we can have a united discussion around ethics within these different seemingly disparate, distinct areas that the project will be covering. And that was all I wanted to say. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Anyone would like to ask any questions? I have 2 questions. We're a bit behind the schedule, so but I'm happy to give you the time for your presentations, and we can shortcut maybe later on in some of the other areas.
Sure.
My question, but just a couple of questions that I really like when you mentioned that it is just not only about open science, it's not making about scientific knowledge accessible. It is the production of that knowledge as well. And in order to be able to do that and to go and do all the inclusiveness and being equitable, it really implies that you have like a co-design methodology right in place. So it is something that it shouldn't even be modeled, yeah, to do knowledge production, to work on your projects, yeah, with intention of being compatible with all these ethical inclusivity and equitable angles. You really need to bring stakeholders and co-design and model this, and that costs money, yeah, that costs. And it's just it costs a lot of efforts, yeah. The stakeholder management in order to ensure that you're doing all this right is a very resource intensive activity that you need to put in place right from the beginning of the proposals and dedicate the right amount of money to that. That was one comment, and the second comment that I had, it was that the dual use, which you mentioned, it is quite a thing to have to monitor, yeah, especially in research infrastructures where most of the data, a lot of the data is open data. So how do you monitor in general what users are doing with their data? It's another expensive activity that you would need to put in place in the design. So people prior to the acquisition of the data, you would need to ask them, right? If you were to do this correctly, you would have to dedicate some efforts within your system design itself in order to be able to track properly the purpose for which the data is being used, which in open data, where there are no restrictions on apply, but that there are licensing and things, but overall, yeah, they can use the data for anything. But if you are gonna have to check whether there are any bad repercussions on unethical misuse of the data, that also is something that requires money and system design.
I mean, I totally agree, and I think it can. I think particularly in discussions of equity and inclusiveness, there is never a point in which you are entirely equitable or entirely inclusiveness, and it does require money to do some of these activities. But I think if you think of equity and inclusiveness and precautionary responsibility, so thinking about open science and dual use, there is a moving scale. There is always going to be more stuff that you can do. But the first things are to have the conversations within your consortia, to have conversations about how can we document the processes so that other organizations or individuals can access it more easily. Even if we are not able to engage with multiple stakeholders, can we make the design thinking around the project transparent so it can be reused and it can be accessible to individuals who would like to come in and potentially use it in the future? So that's the first step towards it. So even if there's not the money for huge amounts of co-creation, saying, do we recognize that maybe there are opportunities for future data integration from other knowledge communities? Can we design a system that is anticipatory of that in the future, even if we can't do it ourselves? Or with dual use, can we have these conversations about whether there are potential for negative reuse and alert people about it when we finish the project? Can we build it into our sustainability planning? That we've had these conversations. So yes, I think it's great if there were money, and in an ideal world there would be money for all these types of things. But I think at the minimum, just having these conversations, these difficult conversations within the consortia, and seeing if you can push just one step further. A lot of it has to do with documentation. A lot of it has to do with transparency and where you decide to put your data and how well documented your metadata is. So I think there are definitely ways that we can work with. Well, I'm saying the ethics board can work with the project consortia to maybe try and advance the critical thinking around these discussions. And I think that's the first step. There's never going to be an optimal, ideal way because there's always more people to include. There's always more considerations to take on board. But just having it as a reflexive conversation is definitely the first step.
Yeah, that's very nice tips. More small steps also count,
Yeah,
right?
first, I mean that's the thing. Like it's taking the first step. That's the important one. After that, it scales.
Yeah, thanks so much, Oli.
Yeah, in principle, in the same direction. So to have this documentation all in place to start the conversation is one side of the medal, but real implications is a second step. So is it expected from our side? So we are not producing the data, we are linking data.
Mm-hmm.
So are we responsible like a web page providing links to not nice content, then we are responsible for this. Is this in the same direction so that we'll have to take care that besides the documentation that the research infrastructures are inclusive from their start? So in principle, we have to have a check prior onboarding process. So it's all about the onboarding process, how the onboarding process is organized, the offboarding process, how is this organized. This we can handle. All the other parts we are not really have not our fingers on it.
Mm-hmm.
So the real implications, do we have to have a statement? If you're using all our data, the dual use is excluded, for example, so that we are not allowing it by definition. So
I mean,
is this part of the terms and of conditions we have to push?
I mean, I don't think there's any legal expectation from around these issues, but I think there is a possibility you could consider a code of conduct for users of the data to outline how you anticipate it. I know Géant has got a code of conduct for their users. There are ways that you could signal what is important to the consortia, but obviously not having any legal obligation to policing or enforcing it, but rather to just say, this consortia believes very strongly in these values and these principles, and we would encourage this to be a model for any users of the infrastructure. Yeah.
That's good. Thanks.
Okay, any more questions? No, then we will go ahead now with Heikki. Can you share the screen? Mm-hmm. All good. You're muted, Heikki.
Sorry about this. I started talking already. A lot of have already been mentioned, and this is probably quite a lot of repetition, but I think that the repetition is mother of all learning anyway. So I just go for it. As mentioned, there are a lot of things that actually we as a research infrastructures can influence. And let's see. For example, this picture, it's not the research it's not environmental data, but it's just something that we all have to be aware of. I mean, it's statistics, and we all know that we can append statistics to our own purposes. And this is totally nonsense statistics once you get look at it carefully. It took me a couple of 10 seconds to figure it out what was wrong with it. So it's just that you can present convincingly whatever data, and you can back it with statistics. So that is something we cannot really influence. So we just have to keep our own place. And there are two things in this figure that are kind of cheating. First of all, of course, is the statistics. And then this representative Jack Kimpler is totally fictional creature. So there are a lot of things, as mentioned, that we cannot influence what comes to how people use our data. So this was also the ethical consideration surrounding the use of environmental data encompasses in transparency, fairness, and potential misuse. And these are not only abstract philosophical concepts, but they are also influencing and impacting the validity of the data and trustworthiness and equitable application of environmental data. So some consideration that we need to think about, first of all, is the data collection bias, which is from the research infrastructure point of view is something that we can influence. So is it the representative data or is it inclusive data? And does it really reflect the true diversity and complexity of the environmental system? And this what we are talking about is a measurement site, how frequent we do our observations, and what are the consequences? The pool selection can lead to totally distorted picture of environment. For example, where you place your air quality measurement site, whether it's next to the highway or is it in the high standard living areas or poor standard rural areas. And usually what at least in my experience in Arctic, the selection of the place is usually a compromise. And for example, New Ålesund research station, it was not selected for the scientific to be a scientific research station because it's so good place. It's just because there used to be a mine and there was infrastructure available. And then when the mine was shut down, Norwegian authorities thought, what should we do about this site? And then came the research. So it's not an optimal place for atmospheric research or any kind of research. It's a compromise. And this we always has to keep in mind when selecting the place. Another example could be how we interpret the data or select the measurement strategy. This is quite often used in Mauna Loa concept, but I use Pallas Sammaltunturi station because I used to be a responsible person of it. So we can see from 98 until last year, there's a steady increase, or not even steady increase, but an increase in CO2. But if we have selected to just take, for example, 3 samples in different time, temporal space, we could interpret the results totally differently, like these 3 spots here. So the oversampling strategy is something we should also look into it. So because we don't know all the variables that are influencing our observations. Data accessibility and transparency, part of the open science, so data should be open accessible for different kind of audience, stakeholders, policymakers, communities, general public. So this requires clear documentation of data collection methods, data quality assessment, and user-friendly data formats. So this is the metadata is a very important part of the data itself, actually. And also language that we are using, semantics, vocabulary, and so forth. At least we that work in the multidisciplinary research infrastructure, even though we are in the earth system sciences, we don't speak same language. Temperature can mean different things. Even temperature can mean different things to different scientists. Privacy and confidentiality. So we need to consider if there's a need for pseudo or totally anonymization of the data, secure storage and handling, and clear communication with the data subjects if these are used about the information and how they will be used. This is not so much that we have to think about when we are doing our environmental observations. Already mentioned that the data can be misinterpreted either intentionally or unintentionally, or misused, or selectively present only certain parts of the data if you want to convey your own agenda. But that is something we cannot really influence. Also, that data visualization, that is something we should think about and also bring the message forward about how can this also be manipulated. So as a data provider, there is some amount we can do to ethical data use, but there also are a lot of degrees of freedom for conveying one's own message. And as a research infrastructure in environmental domain, we should also be environmental responsibility, as we all are, so to minimize the impact of the research infrastructures themselves and using sustainable practices. And this is actually something we are working quite a lot in Arctic realm. So we are the most of the emissions come from logistics to remote sites. So we really need to think how to combine logistics, or are all the expeditions necessary? Can there be alternative ways to conduct them? And also energy production. Usually these are diesel generators due to harsh conditions. There are not so much availability of greener energy. But these are something is studied quite a lot, and also here at the Longyearbyen. So one way to decrease the environmental footprint is actually remote access, but that has its own demands, and not all the work can be carried out by the technicians at site. And a lot of effort also put to automatizations. But again, there is a problem what comes to data transport or transfer to the remote northern locations, and there are, I think Starlink can get up to 80 degrees, but that's kind of a limiting factor in the automatization as well. And this has been very much on the table in Arctic context, data sovereignty and indigenous knowledge. How to involve indigenous knowledge and actually the local and indigenous communities and collecting and actually interpretation and taking benefits of the data. And there is in Svalbard, I'm starting to be Aboriginal. I've been here now more than 7 years, and typical turnaround time is 3 to 4 years. So, but otherwise there are no indigenous people around. But in the Arctic and SEON and AMAP context, this is very, very important to take into account, and it's not always easy and takes a lot of time to get the trust of indigenous people and get them to work with us. But that was what I had, just some few consideration what comes to our own environmental research infrastructure. Yeah.
Thanks, Heikki. Very nice presentation. I really like the angle on the observations and the data collection, the bias and the data management. How can people really play with the statistics, right? Really important thing. What are the smallest steps that we can do as a project, as environmental research infrastructures? What are the smallest steps that we could do, the baby steps that we could do to ensure, in a way, yeah, how can you harmonize all this bias, or there are no standard methods of presenting the data or manipulating or processing the data. Are there any baby steps or recommendations that we could do to avoid, yeah, this handling, this malhandling, bad handling of the data? It's a difficult question, but I don't know if you have from experience, yeah, baby steps that we could do in terms of.
Yeah, I think there is not like big things we can do about the restriction the use of data or misuse of data. Or best we can do is to report the data that we are delivering as much best as possible. So the information is there, and of course we can follow what's happening, but that is not.
Yeah.
We cannot follow all the channels.
Yeah. I don't know if there are good practices that we could use as nice ways. It would be nice to put a catalog out there of nice visualizations. And sometimes people would do it out of non-intentional. They would do it out of lack of knowledge. And I give you one example. We bring together notebooks in the project to extract all these CCBs, and maybe we could publish all those notebooks as in a very prominent catalog, so that people go and see what is a good practice. Yeah, so you don't end up with misuse of data, unintentional misuse of data. And training activities obviously they're also important. Again, not that we have lots of resources on that, but yeah. Uli.
Yeah, once again, in principle, what we'll have to do is we have to bring our own code of conduct that we want to follow good practices, and there are several documents around we can cite on, so that we are intended to follow the best practices in scientific research, and we expect that all our data is used like this. And we have to find a good way to, because you never know, you can't look in the brains of people what their intentions are. You can just say, okay, this is what we want, and we expect from you the same.
Yeah. Yeah. And a very nice topic on the indigenous communities, Heikki. Yeah, which is, you would think that environmental data, as you mentioned, there are no issues like sensitive data or whatever, but this is exactly one example of indigenous data and how you get the trust from them. It's crucially important to get those areas of remote places into the picture as well. I hope there are dedicated projects to bring those kind of things. Yeah, I went to Australia and the indigenous community was huge there, and there was very nice collaboration. That I even saw governance models to deal with the indigenous communities, and so it's nice again that there are collaborations on how how to treat. Probably each indigenous community is a world on its own, but if there are any practices that can be shared, that will be wonderful as well. Okay, I'm gonna just announce I have to leave in 10 minutes. I will hand over the handling of this meeting to Matteo, not because this is not interesting, it's super interesting, but I really need to handle another very important call. So Matteo will take over, but I hope I can see your presentation, Stavroula. So I will leave Shepard in 10 minutes. And after that, Matteo will take over, and Oli and Delphine can support and do all this exchange of conversation, yeah, with you. So Stavroula, if you can share the screen and unmute yourself, yeah. And thanks so much for doing this work.
Thank you. Can you see it? Yes. I have prepared about 20 slides, but I will try to skip quite a few of them to keep time short. Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to share some thoughts regarding the fundamentals, regarding the ethics framework and the code of conduct, which I myself think is also a good thing to have. I start by saying a few things about what ethical analysis is about. There are different institutional spheres which form different disciplines, of course. It's science, and here I mean empirical sciences, policy, and the law, and ethics. Now, or ethics or bioethics, unlike science and scientific explanation, ethics deals with justification. It's normative and not explanatory. It asks the question why and offers reasons for doing X or Y or abstaining from doing something. It's practical reasoning. In that respect, it shares methodology with the law. Ethics and the law are normative, unlike empirical sciences, which are causal explanatory. But there are differences between the law and ethics, of course, and they should not be confused, although they're linked. The law demands conformity, is rule-governed like ethics, but it has an additional feature, which is the external constraint of sanctions. If I don't obey the law, the rule that the law prescribes, there will be sanction. I will be penalized. Ethics is not like that. The only penalty, so to speak, is our conscience and the rejection of others. So it's the sphere of reason giving about action, but which is based on absolute freedom. It's freedom that defines the realm of ethics. I will, of course, qualify this in a minute. Now, regarding the ethics approaches of the European Union, they're all principle-based. That is to say, they try to detect the criteria of right action, moral action, based on principles. So, in the various codes of conduct, the various codes of ethics, framework of ethics, you find everywhere principles. So it's a principle-based approach. And I will follow that too. Now, an epistemological distinction, which is important here because it causes a lot of confusion everywhere and in policy documents, is a distinction between principles and values. They're not identical. Values are goal-directed. They're teleological concepts. They relate to somebody's or a community's good. They're related to what is good, whereas principles are related to what is required. Principles have to do with fundamental rights and freedoms of personality. They both form types of practical reasoning, but the goal is different. Values are diverse and relative. Principles are universal, concern everybody, like the principle of equality. It's for everybody. Values, I repeat, are only bound within certain communities according to the goals and the goods which the communities set. So code of ethics should have principles on the one hand, fundamental principles with which the freedoms and rights of human beings are related, and then values like sustainability, environmental sustainability. That's a value, it's not a principle. Values somehow accompany our reasoning about principles. Now, methodology, because ethical or ethics assessment has its own methodology, practical reasoning, as I said. First, we look at the research objectives and we assess them ethically. Then the very research methodology itself. How do we go about collecting, for example, our human participants, if it's such a study? What are the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, and why? Consent procedures for those included, data protection mechanisms, research with non-human animals, other life forms, biodiversity, abstract features of the environment, forms of experimentation, and so on and so forth. All these carry ethical import, and they have to be assessed ethically. And thirdly, the impact of research, the estimated potential impact of research, which may be diverse again, impact on humans, on abstract features of the environment, such as the climate, local populations, indigenous populations, fear and threats of marginalizing, intentionally or unintentionally, threats of malevolent use. Yes, indeed, we have to take that into account when we assess a project from the start. Areas of ethical analysis that were very clearly presented, and indeed they are clearly documented in the draft document, in the draft deliverable: data, AI, humans. Ethical challenges. Each of these areas raises, and that's how I think we should start, by pinpointing the ethical challenges in each particular area. Some of the ethical challenges are common in all three areas: cyber attacks, malfunctions, or system-level accidents. Should be taken provisions about them. Quality and representatives of data, it's already mentioned. Poor selections, Heikki said, can lead to distorted pictures of the environment, and not only, can have also diverse consequences for those affected, local populations, communities, and so on, let alone the very scientific quality of the research itself. Lack of diversity may lead to biased or false predictions, and of course automation raises a huge number of challenges. Each has to be dealt with in its particular contexts. Of course, we are very much aware of this unprecedented power that AI system had to classify. Now here we have privacy regarding humans, privacy-related harms. We have risks of re-identification. I wonder whether there are technical means to combat this problem, or we're eternally going to face it as AI systems develop. Informed consent, I dare say that in the age of big data and AI, the force, the moral force of informed consent procedures to protect subjects diminishes. So we have to find other intelligent ways to protect fundamental rights and freedoms of participants, of all stakeholders involved, and not merely the traditional informed consent procedures. There are debates here in bioethics regarding the appropriate model of informed consent, in order to be able to deal with the challenges of big data. Because in the age of big data, individual informed consent procedures are extremely weak. And sometimes they cause, last bullet, threats of disproportionate regulatory burdens. They're there inside this disproportionate regulatory burdens, and we should be very aware of this and try to avoid it as much as possible for very many reasons, scientific and societal. Question, who owns data? I don't like ownership. I don't think that anybody owns data. Data are part of one's, if we talk about personal, sensitive data, they're part of one's personality, extracted from one's body, but we don't own our body. We are our body. Our body is part of our personality. So we have a different relation to our body and its data from the relation we have to our PC or our shoes. So ownership is not a good word, in my view. Control, yes. Who has control? And at which stage of data extraction? Then intellectual property issues, data sovereignty, Heikki mentioned it. I prefer it to ownership. And this idea, which is evaluative, meaningful data control and access right. Now, we have to explain what meaningful means, because that's an ethical concept, and that takes a lot of arguing and reasoning and justification. We need an ethics framework. There's so many of them. There's so many codes of ethics around within European Union itself. They're diverse. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. They set different priorities of principles and sometimes no priority at all. So I think one major problem is this multiplicity of principles and ethical principles and ethical codes, which need to be harmonized and unified. At some level or other, this harmonization is wanted. I mean, European level, not our level here. A note of caution is that we cannot mechanize ethical reasoning completely. We should not rely absolutely and only on data masking techniques in order to meet the ethical challenges, new and old ones, related to data collection, integration, and so on. We need to go to fundamental principles. This is the European Union approach, and I like it. It's principle-based, as I said earlier, for data governance. The cornerstone is human agency. It's rightly mentioned here in the document, Ethics by Design and Ethics of Use Approaches for Artificial Intelligence, EU, adopted by the document that's been delivered to us, and that's right. But respect for human agency is not merely a principle, it's a status concept. It relates to the UNESCO reference to dignity, because dignity is the moral status of the human being qua agent. And what does that mean? Being an agent means being capable of exercising freedoms and taking responsibilities for them. Being capable of doing X rather than Y, obeying or disobeying, and giving reasons for what one does, responsibility. This is called moral autonomy, or if you like, normative self-governance. We are the only beings on earth who are capable of normative self-governance. This is called moral autonomy. And the other side is dignity. Dignity means unconditional moral worth. And what is moral worth? Moral status, the ability to exercise freedoms and take responsibility for them, give reason for them. And that's what we call respect for personality or human agency. So respect for personality, respect for human agency, dignity, and moral autonomy are status concepts. They're the cornerstone. They're the fundamental ground from which all principles follow. But which principles? fundamental principles. There are 4. They may begin different content in different areas of application, but formally, there are 4 fundamental principles deriving from the status concept called dignity or human agency. Personal autonomy, not moral, personal. Respect for each one in one's individuality, participant or stakeholder, including, of course, the researchers. Against deception, manipulation, coercion. From this fundamental principle number 1, respect for individual rights follow. Fundamental rights of personality follow from the principle of personal autonomy. Includes privacy, data protection, informational rights, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. Second principle, non-maleficence, primum non nocere. Rejecting principles of injuring, coercing, manipulating, the requirements for safety and security regarding data collection and use and so on are derived from the principle of non-maleficence. Beneficence, not merely not doing harm, but science and its outcomes should do good to persons, to society, to future generations, the environment at large. So doing good. What this means that we have to, whatever we do with data, we have to proceed with a risk opportunity analysis. And when we say risk, we mean probability and severity of envisioned harm, whereas benefit is something that promotes the good related to values, as I said earlier. So we need, in relation to these 2 principles which should go together, risk management methodology. The GDPR and the AI Act incorporate both. Justice, now that's a huge issue here, demands, it's an ancient concept, justice, thematized by philosophy. It demands, in its bare bones, every person to be guaranteed their due. There are different kinds of justice. Distributive justice or fairness. The EU likes talking about fairness. Fairness means distributing justice, how goods should be distributed and allocated. Equity is different. Equity means fair access. Steps to avoid unintended bias, non-discrimination, inclusion is an offshoot of justice, a form, if you like, of justice. And then we have environmental justice. Justice regarding the ecosystem is a huge debate here, how to interpret it. But there are different kinds of the principles of justice applying to different types of research. And lastly, without which nothing, no other principle could be in place, solidarity, pro-social actions, and at the policy level, regulations intended to support others, not merely what we owe to them, but something more. It's this something more that makes us into a community, into society. Solidarity, based participation in research, for example, not merely because the participant expects to gain something, but we do it for the sake of knowledge and its outcomes for society. That's the principle of solidarity. Benefits sharing, and as an offshoot, open science in the full-fledged way, as we heard earlier, is precisely linked to the principle of solidarity. Now, those are the fundamental principles deriving from dignity or the status of the human being. But we also have middle-range procedural principles. Now, regrettably, in many ethics codes and general documents, they are all messed up together. No, then they should not be. Informed consent is not a fundamental principle. It's operational. Just shows whether the principle of respect for autonomy is in place and is not being violated. Non-coercion, non-deception. That's why we need the principle of informed consent. And relatedly, privacy and data governance. They derive from the fundamental principle of autonomy. Prevention, precautionary principle, important, but we have to talk about its limits and its scope. It's not an absolute principle. And lastly, the proportionality principle, which is very common in the documents of the European legislator. Proportionality. Now, that's an evaluative concept too. It includes the GDPR requirement for the minimization of data. That's again. Now, when it comes, I continue with procedural, not moral principles, to data and AI systems, accountability. Now, here, we need mechanisms of distributed responsibility to be in place. Transparency, yes, we need transparent and auditable methodologies, explainability. Of course, you're familiar far more than I am with how this can be actionable, the demand for explainability of algorithms, interoperability, reproducibility. I emphasize that, it's very important. We have to invest in research that improves the reproducibility of AI systems. This is related with what follows: managing biases, selection of appropriate data streams, methodological robustness. And we should bear in mind, and Heikki's presentation made it more than clear, that scientific validity is an ethical requirement as well. It's not merely a scientific methodological requirement. All this combination of respect for fundamental principles and the procedural principles lead to trustworthy systems of collecting and using data basis collections and so on. I call it an ethics of responsibility. Above all, the potential gaps should be identified and addressed by designing the right kind of distribution of knowledge and human control on AI-driven data systems in order to avoid situations in which someone may be wronged and nobody can be legitimately held responsible. That's a moral requirement. Human beings should exercise appropriate levels of judgment. Now, not principled judgment, applying principles to particular cases, that is, and remain responsible for the development, deployment, use, and outcomes. Trustworthy governance framework. Now, the governance framework includes other things as well: scientific aspects, policy-making aspects, legal aspects, but also at its core is the ethics framework. The aim is individual, social, environmental well-being. Allow me to say, therefore, that the principle, this goal listed as a principle on a par with respect for human agency is fallacious. This is not a principle. It's our goal when we apply the principles from the very conception of a research project, from the very idea of a research project. Pathways: investing in science, research, and infrastructure in the proper way to take account of all these challenges, which are not merely scientific, but also practical and moral challenges. Open science, data sharing, but also, as Louise said, inclusive, equitable, and sustainable science. Indeed, the moral limit is not to allow, when using data or integrating data, to take decisions that may prove detrimental to individual communities, harmful services, or detrimental to the environment as a whole. We need to define clearly best practices for particular purposes in particular contexts for just and equitable benefit sharing from data sharing, in our case, responsible governance and oversight, public engagement. Indeed, open science includes public engagement at its very core, European, but also global cooperation. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't take too long, which perhaps I did. Oh dear. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stavroula. It was a really beautiful presentation. I really liked everything. I found especially interesting the part about the fundamental principles. And if I can start with the questions. So you mentioned the EU ethics frameworks, the various and different frameworks. So with the fast development of AI, big data, and other digital tools, do you feel that the current EU ethics requirements are keeping pace? Because I feel like that with the speed of the development of technology, it's like it is so difficult to keep up with the regulations. It's like a race, where the opponent is too fast. This is the feeling that I have. You can share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for the yes. I share your skeptical question. There are two issues here to me. One is very many principles hanging around in very many different documents, even AI documents, different principles. Their starting point is different. They put, as I said, together principles which are not of the same epistemological level. And then one wonders what's going on here. Too much. It's too much. I mean, the Americans perhaps say, you Europeans have far too many regulations, recommendations, and so on. So that's the one thing, harmonizing and unifying. The principles are simple and short. There are not that many. That's one thing. The other thing, as you say, but are these principles enough with this tremendous disruptive technology pace? Can we keep up? Yes, I think we can, so long as we know what ethics is about. Ethics is a way of constraining action regarding development and use of technologies, scientific outcomes, and so on. Okay. We live in a society at the very core of which are these fundamental principles. If we want to keep on living with demands and expectations of respect for freedoms and of personality and human rights, fundamental rights, if we believe in that, we have to apply these fundamental principles in the way we develop science and technology and use science and technology. But that means that in our interpretation of these principles, our interpretation and harmonization of these principles has to co-evolve with the technological advances and the scientific advances. So they should go hand in hand, and the one should feed the other, so to speak, in its interpretation. We have not been doing that, however. We just state principles, we state values, and yet another document of stating values. We don't need that. We need to discuss in an intelligent and robust way the applications of the principles we already have. And there we need the engineers, the software, the programmers, the developers, the manufacturers, all stakeholders, plus the ethicists, the legal representatives, the policymakers, and then we have to give specific recommendations addressing specific audiences, the users, the manufacturers, the policymakers, the legal, the legislator, specific recommendations for each stakeholder. We have enough principles, but we have to interpret them, and their interpretation co-evolves with the sciences and technology.
Yeah, thank you very much. I completely agree with that. And yeah, so we are a little bit tight on time, but does anyone have any questions for Stavroula?
Yeah, there's Daniele Bailo from the EVOS Research Infrastructure. Thank you for the very interesting presentation and which gives kind of the study points and reference points for an informed discussion on AI ethics. There's one point that is very relevant for me, and here is where I think we need maybe a suggestion, and that's about the proliferation of ethical guidelines, which I think is one of the evil also because according to some authors, it paves the way for this ethical kind of ethical greenwashing, meaning that you can cherry pick the principles that you like and say that you are ethical compliant. So I think that it's very urgent, not just to raise that we need ethical guidelines because we have these, but to get to a sort of standards. So what can we do in practice as researchers, as data practitioners, to at least for avoiding increasing the amount of available principles or guidelines, and how can we converge towards kind of common standards? Is there any suggestion? Because I would really like to avoid to increase the entropy and confusion on that side. So what are the suggestions?
If I heard you properly, you mentioned the so-called ethics washing, and I agree with you. You did. Yes, you're absolutely right. Then, as if it's an as if clause. We just tick boxes, for example, and then we've done with all that called ethics. So it is really a way of using ethics for ethically dubious ways. So we want to avoid that, the bureaucratic understanding of ethics, to say the least. But on the other hand, our documents, I think, have to be simple. The principles should not be proliferated. We don't need to proliferate principles, but we can form what you call standards, and I call best practices, and best practices involve standards. So we can do that so long as we concentrate on cases in particular contexts. So in our context here, I would like to know from the package leaders, perhaps, what are the challenges? What are the open questions regarding the collection, integration, use of data? What are the challenges? And then according to the challenges, we have to communally discuss how we go from principles, fundamental and operational, to particular standards for the particular context. That needs work, additional work to what I've just stated, or just what the codes of ethics state as principles, which include values, which include goals, which include everything. So my answer is that it's a long, not necessarily long, but it's a process that we have to go through in order to make ethics really relevant to particular contexts of research. And then, of course, we need education. We need discussion. We need researchers to take part in this, not merely be given sheets of paper to fill in what are your inclusion and exclusion criteria, for example, or do you include vulnerable groups? I mean, they're important, these questions, but they're the starting point. We have to go a bit further in our reasoning and discussion. I think we have so many codes, so many, ethics codes. Now we need to take up the next step.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Okay, thank you very much to all the presenters.